Yes, please continue, Mr. Tigar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just before we adjourned, I had spoken of how Dr. Karadžić referred to, quote, my order number 7 in circumstances that debunked his claim that he was not aware of what the Drina Corps had been ordered to do as reflected in the directive. In addition, Karadžić explained to Đorđević that the objective of, quote, my directive number 7, unquote, had been to, quote, raise the temperature to the boiling point, unquote. That's T25907 through 08. A neat, if macabre, description of what that portion of Directive 7 was designed to do, make life unbearable. Karadžić also claims that Directive 7 did not restrict humanitarian aid to non-Serbs. If the non-Serb population did not receive the aid, it was because the Muslim army misappropriated it. This false claim that Directive 7 was never applied in practice relies upon a limited number of documents cited in footnote 2783 of his brief. They provide little support for the assertion. In a number of instances, the cited documents themselves make reference to restrictions, for example, D2125 or D2115, and in some instances are not related to convoys at all. The reality is that, as was plainly apparent to everyone, the enclave was being strangled and starved. Harland observed that Directive 7's goal to strangle the enclaves was, quote, completely consistent with what we viewed, unquote, T2202 through 03. Similarly, General Smith, referring to Directive 7 in the paragraph describing the method of squeezing the enclave, explained that it is what UNPROFOR saw in March and April, T11.320 through 21. As Franken said, it was, quote, convoy terror, unquote, P4175, paragraph 26. As for ABIH misappropriation, the two documents Karadžić relies upon, D3313 and D3956, are about the period before Directive 7 and therefore add little to an understanding of the post-Directive 7 squeeze. The documents he cites, which are relevant to that time frame, confirm little more than that food delivered to the enclaves through convoys was also eaten by soldiers, which in a town under siege is the only option, a fact reflected in D3308. Further, the quantities listed in the documents are relatively modest. For example, 18 tons out of 300 tons of flour, 70 liters of fuel, and in any event, not of a scale that could have been the decisive factor for the suffering of the Muslim population. The reality instead is reflected in P4142, which describes the horrendous situation in Srebrenica at the beginning of July 1995, with less than 25% of the enclave's needs being met due to the, quote, persistent refusal by the VRS, unquote, or by the BSA, unquote, to allow convoys into the enclave. Your Honors, you've asked how Directives 4 and 7 relate to the overarching JCE. And I'll answer the first part of that question, which is divided into two parts. The answer to that question, how they relate to the overarching JCE, can be found in the first footnote to the Podrinja summary in Annex A of the prosecution's brief, which indicates that the events described include persecution and deportation or forced transfer as set out in paragraphs 52, 56 through 57, 69, and 72 through 74 of the indictment. Now, those paragraphs of the indictment reflect precisely the events that I've just related, alleging that, first, the overarching JCE resulted in takeovers in the municipalities in 1992, but that Srebrenica was not taken over until 1995, that's paragraph 52. That although most of the Bosnian Muslims and Croats from the municipalities had been forcibly displaced by the end of 1992, acts of forcible displacement continued with the attacks on Cherska and Konjević-Polya between January and March 1993. Just talked about that. That's at paragraph 72. That as a result of the cleansing, many Bosnian Muslims fled to Srebrenica, which was declared a safe area, paragraph 73. And that beginning in March 1995, in the continuing pursuit of the common purpose, a plan was devised to take the enclave and forcibly transfer or deport Bosnian Muslim population. That's paragraph 74. I'd like to move on now to a related topic, to the VRS, closely related topic, and that's the discussion about...
You will be dealing with the second question with respect to that question.
Ms. Pack will deal with that.
The interplay will be dealt with separately.
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. President. So, as explained in the prosecution pretrial brief, Karadžić attempted during the course of this case to distance himself from VRS crimes by falsely asserting a dramatic schism between himself and Mladić, contrary to the evidence reflected both in public statements and in private discussions that Mladić, despite tensions, remained committed to the chain of command. Karadžić distances himself from the VRS achievements for once he proudly took credit by claiming A, there was no mutual agreement between himself and Mladić on anything, and therefore no JCE, and B, he had no control over Mladić. With respect to the first claim, although Karadžić and Mladić may have disagreed about various issues, including operational issues, and including Mladić's view that Karadžić's cronies were corrupt, you find that in P1487, P136, P1489, page 79, and P1473, page 47, there was unmistakably one thing on which they clearly agreed: the risk posed by too many Muslims and the need to reduce their number within the territory of RS. In support of his corollary claim that he had no control over Mladić, the defense brief cites to witnesses whose evidence contains sweeping generalizations, are demonstrably biased, or whose evidence actually demonstrates the contrary. For example, Karadžić, who, as I mentioned before, is cited for so many propositions in the brief, is cited in support of the claim that Mladić only provided information about logistical problems and resisted control. This is another brazen falsehood, as plainly revealed by the record of the meetings I've related preceding the directives. Instead, Karadžić and Karadžić told the army what to do, and they did it. Subotic is cited as someone who testified about a, quote, vast number of examples of military disobedience, unquote. Now, whether accurate or not, Subotic's examples do not relate to military operations, and certainly not the cleansing operations, but to various organizational issues. To the contrary, when asked by the presiding judge in the Karadžić case to identify any operation in which Mladić went beyond what the political leadership wanted him to do, Subotic was unable to name one. That's T40047. Mandić is cited, but is also unable to identify any military operations in which Mladić exceeded his authority, which is unsurprising in view of Mandić's acknowledgement that he had no familiarity with military reporting. That's C2, pages 682 through 83. Ninkovic's alleged claim that Mladić annulled an order based on a decision of the Supreme Commander, paragraph 1259, is another misrepresentation. It turns out that this was a marginal issue that Mladić did not annul, but that Ninković himself changed after discussion with Mladić. That's D3733, paragraphs 39 through 40. The defense also relies on the claim that Milosevic called Karadžić that, quote, crazy doctor, unquote, or that, quote, lunatic from Pale, unquote, and told Mladić that the VRS main staff should follow decisions made in Belgrade, not Pale, which Mladić allegedly accepted. This is yet another misrepresentation. Milosevic did claim that Karadžić was a lunatic caught up in epic historical fantasies who was trying to take and keep territory that had never belonged to Serbs, in contrast to the more limited territory that Milosevic had willingly helped him grab. And for that, see P 1473, pages 130 through 131, and P 2604. But when Milosevic tried to get Mladic to oppose Karadžić, Mladic demurred, pointing out that attempts to divide the Serbs in Bosnia into Karadžić's men and Mladic's men, if not stopped, could lead to further divisions. Mladic emphasized that he had no political ambitions, wished to serve the people as a soldier, and should be perceived solely in that light. P 2567, page 2. Finally, and even more astonishingly, Karadžić cites Milovanovic in support of a much-repeated claim that the structure of the main staff meant that the supreme commander was not really in control of the army. In fact, Karadžić put that very issue to Milovanovic, who told him it was wrong. Quote, "Command and control of the army during the war was not two-headed, as it were. We remained under your personal command," unquote. T 25632. As Milovanovic made clear at another point, quote, "War is too serious for generals to be in charge of it. Politics has to get involved. The politicians carry out wars." T 25494. Now, the defense brief also covers exchange commissions, which the prosecution's brief outlines at paragraphs 243 through 251 and 522 through 24, which discusses, among other things, the origins and functions of the Exchange Commission, which had already been contemplated in April to deal with a large number of non-Serbs already incarcerated and was aimed at civilians, as both Mandić and Subotic admitted. That commission aimed at civilians was functioning within a week of its formal establishment on 8 May 1992, as reflected in the expulsion of 400 Muslim civilians from Bratunac to Muslim territory via Pale, and continued to function as a mechanism for the expulsion of civilians throughout the indictment period. Karadžić claims that, quote, "The Exchange Commission did not serve as a vehicle for the removal of non-Serbs, since it clearly prohibited exchanges of Muslims," unquote, and that Muslim civilians were unconditionally released. That's at paragraphs 1026 and 1034 of his brief. The former assertion is based upon a portion of the 6 June 1992 order by the President of the Exchange Commission, which provides that women, children, elderly, and helpless persons, quote, "should be released immediately without conditions or exchange." Now, recognizing the obvious problem with this limited formulation, the defense brief asserts, without any support, that the fact that the men were not mentioned does not mean that male civilians were supposed to remain in custody. But according to the then Minister of Justice, Mandić, that is precisely what it means. That is, that the express provisions for releasing civilian women, children, and elderly do not apply to men. And for that, see C2, pages 159 through 160. Further, as we explained at paragraph 248 of our brief, even the order to immediately release women, children, and elderly was not intended to be implemented in light of the contradictory language in the order itself, as well as the fact that thousands of women, children, and elderly continued to be expelled under the auspices of the Exchange Commission. Indeed, it was the imprisonment and exchange of prisoners such as teenage girls and elderly men that prompted defense witness and Kula prison warden Skiljevic to complain to the Minister of Justice that this process was being applied to civilians, complaints that the minister ignored. T 36931 through 36932. The latter assertion made by Karadžić in connection with the Exchange Commission, that Muslim civilians were unconditionally released, is based upon two items. The first is a single exchange in June 1992 involving 17 Muslims and a larger number of Serbs. That item reflects nothing more than a single exchange, in contrast to a comprehensive program of release. and in any event appears to reflect an admission that these were civilians who were detained. And the second basis for the claim that Muslim civilians were unconditionally released is the testimony of defense witness Slobodan Avlijaš. But a more accurate view of the Bosnian Serb leadership's position toward civilian detention and expulsion can be gleaned from Avlijaš's consistent disregard of the status of the prisoners. When Avlijaš, who was, according to Mandić, the Minister of Justice member in charge of exchange, that's C2, page 160, when he went to Vogasha and Iliash in July 1992, because of pressure from the international community, he found a, quote, truly horrific, unquote, situation in Vogasha and a warehouse in Iliash, quote, packed, unquote, with Muslims in civilian clothing, many of whom recognized him and begged him for help in getting out of what he acknowledged was, quote, this hell, unquote. He made no effort to determine whether there was any genuine basis for their detention, but instead told them that they might be able to get out in an all-for-all exchange. Similarly, when he went to Karadžić in October, he found Muslims who had been, quote, viciously mistreated, unquote, when first taken prisoner in May, and who were still incarcerated due to a failed exchange. He knew they were not extremists, and he knew that because these people were his neighbors, his son's best friend among them. They were crying and begging for help. He wasn't told that they were soldiers. He was told they were people who had been collected in areas where combat was taking place. But asked in court what he did to get them immediately released, Avlijaš said, quote, you know, at that time, whoever said anything, they did not fare well. You needed to be very wise to keep your skin, unquote. T 35181. As a man who understood what it took to keep his skin, he was put in charge of 2 of the 3 government so-called investigations into camps in the aftermath of the international outcry following the exposure of Omarska, neither one of which made any effort to do anything more than speak to those who ran the camps and determine how many people were currently in detention facilities. So, for example, his report on Vlasenic's Susica camp, where Muslims had been brutally mistreated, was benignly summarized on the basis of information from the police commander. Quote, at the beginning of combat activities, a number of people of Muslim nationality were isolated in this place and were later transferred to other places, parentheses, mean Batkovic, and parens, or exchanged for people of Serbian nationality. P 1607, page 2. Avlijaš also testified that a large portion of the population of Karadžić had been imprisoned in Kula, that, quote, residents of Dobrinja and Grbavica had been also taken there, and that the Vrbanja Bridge was, quote, where civilians were usually released and exchanged, unquote. In short, in contrast to this false defense claim, Avlijaš's evidence made clear that the exchange of civilians was an active part of the expulsion process. I'd next like to turn to the false claim of lack of communications. The prosecution's brief at paragraphs 483 through 503 details the comprehensive and redundancy-laden communications network available to Karadžić, including the Republican Communications Center, the RS MOOP Communications, VRS Communications, PTT Communications, couriers, state security, and official and unofficial visits. Municipality summaries similarly reflect communications between the Republican and local levels. The record of contacts between Republican level and the field confirm the adequacy of these systems and the existence of ongoing communications both prior to and during the course of the war. And see paragraphs 504 and 509 of our brief for further details. Against this backdrop, the defense position veers from complaints that the system functioned, quote, poorly, or with difficulty, almost invariably without specification of the particular period, duration, or extent of the difficulties. It veers from those allegations to misleading, untenable, and even bizarre overstatements. For example, the brief asserts that the state of communications was so bad that not even Sarajevo municipalities could reach Pale. That's at paragraph 510. The purported support for this proposition? A conversation in which a Sarajevo official asks for the Pale leadership, is told I can't reach Pale, and then responds that he just reached them last night. That's D3750, page 1. Similarly, Karadžić asserts at paragraph 538 that a mere 24 telegrams were exchanged between the Sarajevo area and the regions outside between April and November 1992. A miserable, or purportedly miserable, communications level. Now, the only problem with this assertion is that the cited document is only a few excerpts from the telegram logbook for April and November, reflecting only a handful of days from that logbook, that is, 3 days in June and 6 days in July, and then purports to blow it up into the entirety of the communication exchange with telegrams during the April through November period.
Interpreter's note, could you please slow down? Thank you.
As it happens, the defense brief essentially admits communications through its contradictory claims regarding communications and allegedly exculpatory orders, sometimes actually in successive paragraphs. Here's some examples. In paragraph 2951, the claim that communication between Rogatica and Pale was virtually non-existent, followed in the next paragraph by, following multiple messages from President Karadžić on the importance of respecting international humanitarian law, the municipal authorities, the Rogatica municipal authorities, took measures to improve the living conditions of the population. Now, these juxtaposed claims would suggest the very laughable proposition that communications were entirely cut off except for exculpatory orders. But astoundingly, that is precisely what the defense brief asserts. For example, in paragraph 2838, the claim that the breakdown of communication in Vlasenica was the result of the destruction of telephone lines. And then in the same paragraph, the few communications received by municipal authorities in Vlasenica emphasized the need to respect human rights and international conventions. Similarly, in paragraph 2945, communication between Foča and the outside world was severed in April until September 1992 or even later. And then the bulk of the communications received in Foča were instructions and warnings from Karadžić regarding the importance of respecting the Geneva Conventions. The facial absurdity of this latter example is only heightened by the defense brief's assertion elsewhere that Foča was indeed in contact with the outside world, and particularly with Pale. And for that, see paragraph 570. Ostojić informed the government on the situation in Foča on April 30th, or paragraph 462. The Ministry of Justice sent a delegation to Foča in June 1992 that reported back to the ministry. These floundering defense efforts to dispute the existence and adequacy of the multiple communication systems only underscores the accuracy of the prosecution's case. Now let me turn now to a subject touched upon in a question by the presiding judge earlier, and that's the issue of orders issued by Karadžić in respect of international law, which he spends considerable time with in the defense brief. It is clear that any genuine effort on Karadžić's part to address the rampant, widespread crime being carried out largely by official RS organs, including the MUP and the VRS, would have required him to take concrete, targeted measures to identify, put a stop to, and punish specific violations. And as mentioned, over the course of its brief, The defense relies upon a number of orders and other documents authored by Karadžić and other members of the Bosnian Serb leadership that, at least on the surface, suggest his disapproval of those crimes. However, their contents and the context in which they were issued demonstrate that these documents reflect efforts to create a paper trail to cover up the leadership's own role in those crimes. They were never intended to be implemented and do not reflect any genuine attempt to stop the massive criminal campaign against non-Serbs. Now, two preliminary matters. First, as I've mentioned, these arguments contradict defense arguments on communication and control, arguing the significance of these republic-level orders related to crimes depend upon, and in many instances concede, effective communications to and from the field. Second, the defense suggestion that orders or even generic language to comply with international law somehow disproves criminal intent is contradicted by both logic and by the tribunal's jurisprudence. It is clearly open to a trial chamber to conclude that an accused's orders to prevent or punish crimes are not genuine and do not negate intent. And for that, you can see the Milutinovic trial judgment, paras 454 through 457, and para 1129, Shinovich appeals judgment, paras 659 through 662, as well as Stanisic and Juplin trial judgment, volume 2 at para 514. And as discussed in the prosecution brief, and as I will outline briefly today, this is the only conclusion borne out by the facts of this case. Now, first, with respect to Karadžić's orders.
Just a second, Mr. Tiga, before you continue. What question from the chamber did you refer to?
You asked me, sorry, Mr. President, I apologize for that confusion. You had asked me earlier about the Cudillero plan and the provisions for compliance with international law that were contained in the alleged agreement. And in the course of my answer, I referred more generally to any facial agreement with such provisions. So it was actually in my answer rather than your question. You had asked specifically about Cudillero, and I broadened it to include these kinds of orders.
Thank you. Yes, actually, my question was, as you observed, limited to Cudillero agreement. Please continue, Mr. Tiga.
Now, the fact that Karadžić was on the one hand issuing instructions or appeals or orders to comply with international standards with respect to prisoners, civilians or prisoners of war, and on the other hand propagating a non-punishment policy that encouraged repeat violations is sufficient by itself to discard such orders and instructions as either window dressing exercises or generic and deliberately ineffective instructions. And all of that amounts to intentional inaction in the face of ongoing mass criminality by his subordinates. Let me look at some examples. The 8 June press release cited by the defense in paragraph 644 of its brief. Now that the defense terms, quote, an urgent appeal demanding that all prisoners be treated humanely and renewing the call for the ICRC to protect civilians and prisoners, unquote. But this document is not even an order. It's a press release expressly linked to meetings with internationals. It contains no actual instructions to any of Karadžić's many subordinates with power and responsibility over prisoners and civilians, and it doesn't contain any means of monitoring or ensuring implementation. In this document, Karadžić praises the fact that, quote, we are not driven by hate but by love, unquote, and that, quote, justice is on our side, unquote. This self-congratulatory remark should be viewed in light of the fact that by this time, Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership have been confronted with numerous reports of crimes from the internationals, including allegations of, quote, large-scale detention of civilians, see P 1029, paragraphs 101 through 102, which matched the reports that the government had been providing, quote, on a daily basis, unquote, to the presidency of irregularities and inhumane treatment in detention facilities. That's C2, page 278. This document, which couples praise for conduct that he knew in fact was criminal with an ultimately empty public appeal, is nothing more than a public relations exercise. Similarly, many orders were issued simultaneously in both English and BCS. For example, D-1754, D-109, and D-93, or brought directly to the attention of the international community, D-4720, making their target audience clear. Equally, the RS Presidency's 11 July 1992 announcement to the citizens of the Serbian Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina stating that emigration has to be voluntary, coupled with a false denial that RS authorities were engaged in ethnic cleansing, that's discussed at paragraphs 652 and 653 of the defense brief, is another obvious window dressing exercise. Indeed, on that same day, at a meeting of senior MOOP officials, Zhuplinin noted that the army and crisis staffs were demanding the gathering of as many Muslim civilians as possible, who were then left in poor conditions in camps guarded by the MOOP, D447, page 7. As the defense brief acknowledges, this information reached the presidency by way of Stanisich's 17 July report, which again made clear that civilians were being rounded up. Now, Karadžić cites his 13 June instructions regarding general compliance by the Army and MOOP with international laws of war and its accompanying instructions on treatment of captured persons. Those are D434 and P1134, as a reflection of his taking, quote, all possible measures, unquote, to prevent crimes against non-Serbs. Given his awareness that the standards set out in those documents had been and were being systematically violated, it is clear that issuing a general set of instructions without taking concrete steps to put an end to the ongoing violations was an empty gesture. The defense reliance on Subatich's claim that these or similar instructions were quickly or effectively disseminated to various organs throughout the RS is, of course, another contradiction to the defense claims about the alleged chaos and lack of communication that reigned at the time. But even assuming Subatich's unsubstantiated evidence on this point were reliable, his supposedly energetic efforts to disseminate such instructions, when contrasted with the absence of efforts by RS authorities to implement them, is a further reflection of the authorities' focus on creating a paper trail rather than genuinely addressing the ongoing mass crime. The fact that Karadžić reissued these instructions on the 19th of August, a fact pointed to in the brief at their brief at paragraph 625, reissued them in the form of an order to the main staff and MOOP, points to the predictable response to these toothless initial instructions. The defense also relies on D95, Karadžić's 14 July order to municipality presidents in the Gorazde area, stating that villages where the Croat and Muslim populations surrender their weapons and do not intend to fight must be protected, adding, quote, the responsibility of this must be borne by the presidents of the municipalities, unquote. But the defense fails to mention the response of Sokolet's president Tupajić to the telegram, that's P6236, in which Tupajić reminds Karadžić, the man at the top of the MOOP and VRS hierarchy, that, quote, all activities on the area of the municipality on security issues are conducted by the SJB, which was responsible for its work to the MOOP, and by the 2nd Romania Motorized Brigade, which was responsible to its superior command, and that these activities are outside Tupajić's knowledge and the knowledge of his closest collaborators. and that it's the SJB and the 2nd Romania Brigade which have to protect the Muslim population because, quote, in conditions as they are now, I cannot take responsibility for their safety, unquote. This response reveals the disingenuous nature of Karadžić's order holding municipality presidents responsible for protecting Muslims and Croats from crimes committed by the organs over which Karadžić himself exercised ultimate authority. The defense also holds up Stanisic's report to Karadžić stating that the army and crisis staffs were rounding up Muslim civilians en masse as a yardstick by which Karadžić's intent should be measured, asserting that Karadžić's actions upon learning about the crimes are critical to establishing his mens rea. It's para 674. Now, setting aside for the sake of argument that Karadžić had ample information about irregularities well before 17 July, at this point, if Karadžić had any genuine intention of ensuring his subordinates' compliance with the law protecting Muslims and Croat civilians in the RS, he would have responded immediately with concrete, targeted measures utilizing his various sources of authority over the army, the MOOP, and civilian authorities to put a stop to this systemic criminal activity being carried out by the army, crisis staffs, and MOOP. Karadžić took no such action. Rather, his next step, according to the defense at paragraph 675, was to issue his 23 July 1992 order, D-96. However, this order is not addressed to anyone, expressly states that it is issued, quote, in keeping with obligations undertaken at the London Conference, does not acknowledge the existence of any criminal activity, let alone the rounding up of large numbers of Muslim civilians, contains no monitoring or implementing instructions, and, as we know from the voluminous evidence of continued massive crime, was in fact not implemented. Simply put, this order and others like it was issued for international consumption and to create a paper trail of plausible deniability, a trail that Karadžić is now attempting to exploit. By any real measure, Karadžić's response to the Stanisic's 17 July report of serious mass crime against Muslim civilians does reflect his intent for those crimes, crimes that would be repeated in the near future and for 3 more years. The defense also points to various statements in which Karadžić purportedly expressed his disapproval of crimes against non-Serbs. Upon closer analysis, however, these statements do not assist his claim. For example, the defense points to extracts from 2 of Karadžić's speeches at the 17th Assembly in July 1992, that's D-92, as remarks which express, quote, his criticism and disapproval of crimes, unquote. The remarks upon which the defense relies, including his comment about convincing Muslims in Pale to stay and asserting that the state is, quote, big enough for all, unquote, must be viewed in light of his assertions at the same session that, 1, Serbs cannot allow a state in which they are a national minority, that's page 16. 2, we cannot live together, there's no tolerance, they quadruple through the birth rate, and we Serbs are not up to that, page 86. His acknowledgement that the conflict had been roused to eliminate Muslims who were in fact vanishing, and the fact that by that time his forces had ethnically cleansed huge swaths of Serb-claimed territory. His nod toward ethnic tolerance at this session was made in a context in which significant progress had already been made to eliminate the demographic threats that he underscored at this same session. The defense also points to a statement in a June meeting with Mladić that, quote, we must not put pressure to have people displaced. P 1478, page 98. But a closer look at the format and content of this entry in the Mladic notebook reveals that this comment came up when the discussion had moved on from Karadžić's concern about demographics and minorities, which was echoed at the 17th session when he described how 33% non-Serbs rendered Serbia unstable, to a new discussion about problems on the Neretva and Karadžić's expression of concern that if they say the Neretva will not be a border, Serbs will feel pressure to leave. Equally, at paragraph 1224, the defense points to Karadžić's statement in a July 1992 meeting with Mladic and the RS civilian leadership that, quote, "We are going to build a law-abiding rather than an ethnically clean state." However, it is clear from the context of this comment that this relates to a discussion of the international community's view of Bosnia. Quote, "We are intrigued by the idea that perhaps the world may want to divide Bosnia in two. The West has no desire for an Islamic statelet, etc." And a discussion about the public stance that the RS should present. Koljević was explicit on this point. Quote, "We should take a stand, discuss law-abiding versus national state, and make our policy known." Following which this position was adopted. Stand taken, law-abiding state, in capital letters. Any contention that the Bosnian Serb leadership genuinely intended to create a law-abiding state that embraced Muslims and Croats is undermined by their continued failure to prevent or punish the widespread and systematic crimes being committed against non-Serbs, crimes of which they were well aware. Now, Karadžić also claims that he acted as soon as he knew, and at paragraph 628 through 629 of his brief, attempts to dismiss crimes, however, dismiss reports of crimes from foreign sources as unreliable, but at the same time asserting that the Republican authorities, quote, "immediately reacted," unquote, to such information. In fact, both claims are untrue. Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership received repeated accurate reports from international sources from early April onwards, which they inevitably dismissed or deflected. For example, in the immediate aftermath of the brutal takeover of Zvornik and the ensuing flood of Muslim refugees, Karadžić was informed of these events by two separate international officials. That's KD, well, I'll recite that later. More generally, as Oken explained, he and Secretary Vance repeatedly informed the Bosnian Serb leadership that they were aware of widespread ethnic cleansing. As Oken put it, quote, "In fact, in all the conversations about ethnic cleansing with the Bosnian Serb leadership, it was highly unusual, almost never the case that they denied it. The almost invariable response was, 'Look what they're doing to our people.'" That's T 1505, 1506. In an example where the Bosnian Serb leadership simultaneously both acknowledged and denied ethnic cleansing, when an international official personally informed Karadžić, Koljević, and Plavšić about the mass deportation of Muslims from Bosanski Novi in July 1992, they responded by declaring that it was a very cruel war and everybody was committing crimes, before changing tack by claiming that the Muslims wanted to leave and were voluntarily signing documents exchanging properties. See the Bosanski Novi summary at paragraph 13. This not only undermines the defense's claim that Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership, quote, "immediately reacted," unquote, to information about crimes, but also Karadžić's denial that the Bosanski Novi deportations were brought to his attention. And you can see that at paragraph 2808. The reason that Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership did not respond to such reports from international officials with concrete remedial measures is not their lack of control over the perpetrators or being, quote, "cut off," unquote, from the field, or any of the other excuses that the defense now advances. Their inaction is the result of the fact that these crimes fell squarely within their shared common purpose to permanently remove Muslims and Croats from the territories they sought. And for confirmation of this, one need look no further than the self-congratulatory manner by which crimes were reported to Karadžić and other members of the leadership by their loyal subordinates and followers who were implementing the common purpose. For example, as mentioned earlier, when Karadžić announced the strategic objectives on the 12th of May, 1992, including that the UNA would form a border, Viestica could not conceal his delight at the happy news, which meant that Muslims they had evacuated, in quotes, from the right bank of the UNA would likely not have a place to return to. Similarly, on the 30th of June in Zvornik, TO Commander Pavlovich bragged to Karadžić and Mladić that, quote, we were most active in evicting the Muslims, P 1478, page 253. A few weeks later, at the July Assembly session, Prstojević, whose expulsion activities had already reached the top level of the leadership and were causing negative publicity, as Mandić would explain to him in June, proudly reported that the Serbs from Sarajevo, following, quote, an encouraging visit from Karadžić, had been driving the Muslims out of the territories where they had actually been a majority. D92, page 66. At that same session, SDS Executive Committee President Dukic expressed the hope that the number of Muslims in Birac had been halved. D92, page 73. Birac being a region in eastern Bosnia that encompassed Zvornik and Bratunac. Zvornik, where the local authorities had already informed Karadžić about their forced eviction of Muslims, and Bratunac, where hundreds of Muslims had been expelled through Pale in May, and about which Karadžić, Mladić, and Koljević had been informed on 6 June, there were no more Muslims as it had been, quote, fully liberated, unquote. That's P 1478, page 101. In stark contrast to Karadžić's deflective responses to reports from internationals about such crimes, when Viestica complained that the proposed agreement would require compensation for, quote, everything we destroyed and burned and the 17 mosques we flattened, Karadžić reassured the deputies that this was not the case and that there would be barbed wire at the borders for a long time. P 1379, pages 25 through 26. When Karadžić's generic orders and appeals to comply with international law are contrasted both with his acceptance of reports from his subordinates about their own crimes and his deflections or denials of reports of crimes coming from internationals, it is crystal clear that Karadžić's orders and appeals were nothing more than an order to paper over the criminal campaign that Karadžić himself was overseeing. That effort, nevertheless, proved unsuccessful. The, quote, clear, unquote, and, quote, inescapable, unquote, conclusion from the course of events, these are the words of two different internationals, was that ethnic cleansing was state policy. That's Banbury at T 13341 and Karadžić at P 3804, paragraph 79. So in late summer 1992, when Karadžić was attempting in vain to convince Vance and Owen that ethnic cleansing was not occurring, and for that see P 799, pages 10 and 14, quote, the fact of ethnic cleansing was, even at that point, being treated as something that was incontrovertible, as Bowen explained, T 10096 through 98. And while Karadžić cites a comment by Lord Owen in paragraph 628 to support his claim of false media reporting, Lord Owen in fact explained that Karadžić's reaction to international protests about ethnic cleansing, providing excuses, promising action, at times even volunteering follow-up information, was, quote, a clever tactic to keep us feeling that our representations were having some impact, unquote. And so while Karadžić did not object to human rights safeguards being put into negotiations, quote, all this, however, was a facade to cover up a deep-seated commitment to Serbs not living alongside Muslims and to conducting an ethnic cleansing program with a barefaced dishonor of even greater magnitude than his continued inability to respect or even to know the truth, unquote, P799, page 14. With respect to orders issued by other members of the Bosnian Serb leadership, the defense also points to paperwork generated by senior MUP officials in late July as responsive to Stanisic's 17 July 1992 report. However, in the face of mounting pressure from the international community, this flurry of documents generated by the MUP and RS leadership, you can see D449, P1097, amounts to nothing more than self-serving finger-pointing, as Mandić testified regarding Kovacs's 8 August letter, that's C2, pages 320 through 322, and Mandić at T4595 through 96. And none of which reflected any steps genuinely aimed at ensuring the unconditional release of these civilians or criminally punishing those responsible for their incarceration and their inhumane treatment. And meanwhile, the large-scale detention, mistreatment, and killing, and the expulsions continued. What is clear from these documents, however, is that all levels of the RS and MUP leadership were well aware of the crimes that were occurring on their watch and by their subordinates. And none of them did anything concrete to stop them. It was not until after international journalists discovered the Prijedor camps and reported on the appalling conditions associated with them that Stanisic, on 9 August, weeks after Župljanin officially reported to him that MUP officials were holding large numbers of Muslim civilians, finally took the simple and obvious remedial step of ordering the release of civilian prisoners. Of course, by this time, for the vast majority of prisoners, Stanisic's promised free movement meant in reality expulsion. Even if given an ostensible choice to return to their homes, having been attacked, imprisoned, and mistreated, and having had those homes destroyed all by the very organs that should have been protecting them, for those people, leaving RS was the only realistic option.
Interpreters, kindly ask Mr. Teger to slow down, please.
The other RS government minister that the defense holds up as a beacon of law and order is Justice Minister Mandić, claiming that he, quote, immediately reacted, unquote, to reports of crimes against non-Serbs in Ilija by calling up Prstojević. At paragraph 702, the brief quotes these extracts of the Intercept. It has come to our attention and that of the government that you are issuing ultimatums to some Turks, evicting people from certain settlements, and people respond badly to it. Please do not do anything like it. We cannot ethnically cleanse Ilija or any other place. At least that is the attitude of the government and political leadership. Leaving aside that the Minister of Justice is here referring to Bosnian Muslim expulsion victims as Turks, this selective citation to this intercept is misleading. In its entirety, the intercept makes clear that Mandić was concerned about the negative publicity surrounding the expulsions rather than the expulsions themselves. He stated that the Muslims and the media are, quote, abusing, unquote, the facts of the evictions, and that this is, quote, very bad publicity for us. He continues that, quote, "It has already reached the top how in some settlements you gave them 24 hours to move out," unquote, and said you are not responsible for their safety. Prstojević's response, that he didn't say it in public or write it. Mandić instructs Prstojević to talk to a Muslim judge and place 2 or 3 Muslims somewhere so that we can say we employ everyone. Muslims, Croats, Serbs, as long as they are loyal to the Serbian state. Thus, the leadership's reaction to information that Prstojević was cleansing Ilija was a complaint to Prstojević about expelling quote-unquote Turks, focusing on the public nature of his crimes, coupled with allegations that it was being abused in the media, an instruction to employ token measures to create a veneer of multi-ethnic existence, and no measures to remove or punish Prstojević for his crimes. The defense's corollary claim that the information that Prstojević was evicting Turks was untrue is astounding in light of the fact that Prstojević was a known extremist whose criminal activities are clearly laid out in contemporaneous intercepts, and his own statement to that effect at the Assembly. For that, see P 1086, pages 2 through 3, and P 515, page 1 through 2. Finally, on the topic of cosmetic orders, while the defense claims that the generic language in Karadžić's 26 April instructions to crisis staffs to, quote, act kindly or humanely toward civilians renders the prosecution's case disastrously wrong, it is once again the context in which those instructions were issued that determines whether they constitute a genuine preventive measure attributable to the accused. If I could just provide that context and then we'll break. That context is provided, Your Honors, by Karadžić's testimony that it was Karadžić's policy that crimes committed by Serbs should not be punished, and that investigation and punishment of such crimes, quote, could be dealt with later, unquote. And Karadžić explained that the 2 key ministries, Justice and Interior, led by Mandić and Stanisic, took the same position as Karadžić. That's, you can see that at our brief at para 549. Irrespective of a policy involving crimes to achieve a level of ethnic purity, irrespective of the ongoing policy, it goes without saying that in an environment in which crimes against non-Serbs are widespread, and the President of the state, the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Justice propagate a policy of delaying the prosecution of such crimes, Karadžić's instructions were largely meaningless. And Mr. President, I understand it's time for a break.
French translation has only now stopped. We'll have a break for 20 minutes and resume at 3:10.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.